All right, I'd like to welcome all of you to the last Rabbi's Talmud class of this year. And as usual, I'd like to list the sponsors for the class: the Susser Foundation, the Skiba family, the Sheeran family, and in memory of Libby and Harold Grill. And let me ask everyone to please mute yourself unless you're asking a question or reading a passage.
Thank you so much, Keith. Welcome, everyone. Due to the Juneteenth celebration recently, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit the Jewish sources on enslavement and see what we find there. And I assure you, there are very, very interesting things on the topic. Before I go to the sources, I would like to ask you for a moment, what do you think is the Jewish take on enslavement? I would like to hear from one or two of you, if I may. Yes, Stephen.
Well, I could just speak historically in this country. In the Confederate South, I did read that Jews were slave owners in, I think, the same proportion as non-Jews.
You are right, and not only that, Stephen, rabbis in the South would use Jewish texts to justify enslavement. So yes, you are absolutely right. So sometimes when we hear about slavery and Judaism, our first idea is that Judaism is totally against enslavement and has always been against enslavement. But we will see tonight that unfortunately that's not true. The idea that Jews are against enslavement is a new idea, a recent idea, and we are very impacted and influenced by the Seder, the celebration of freedom that we do on Pesach, and on everything we know about Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Martin Luther King, and so many other passages that highlight freedom. But we must acknowledge that that wasn't always like that. And Judaism has some harsh, tough passages on slavery, and we will visit some of them tonight. Yes, Harold.
I was going to say there are all sorts of regulations about how to treat slaves, so it had to be fairly common.
Exactly, 100%. So the fact solely that we have so many regulations on how to treat slaves, it means that enslavement was accepted and was common among our ancestors. Yes, Sandra.
Well, I always wondered why, right after the Jews left Egypt and then they're in the desert and they're getting the 10 Commandments, it never made any sense to me why there wasn't a commandment that said, "Thou shalt not have slaves."
Right.
What I've been told is that it's evolutionary but not revolutionary, the whole process of not having slaves, but also idols. Why, it says thou shalt not have idols in the 10 Commandments, and that was also very prevalent. So why, I always wondered why idols were not allowed, but slavery was not one of the 10 Commandments.
And not only that, Sandy, which I agree with you 100%. Also, Jews were enslaved by Jews. And this is what we are going to see tonight. There were two categories of slaves, the non-Jewish slave and the Jewish slave. And Jews used to enslave Jews. and which is very, very difficult to accept and to get, right? As you said, they left Egypt, they had the experience they had, so we would expect that it would be one of the commandments. Maybe the 11th commandment should be, you should not enslave any human being.
Rabbi, I'm just wondering something. Was it very possible that back then the definition of slavery was somewhat different than what we consider it now or during the Civil War or whatever with the blacks? Was the definition different? I know there were rules, but was there a different definition of what slavery was?
Do you want to expand a little bit about that?
Well,
What do you mean about a different definition?
well, in the
that look like?
makeup of the entire, let's say, the economy or how business operated, functioning things in society, was it, it obviously was accepted, but was it defined a little different than what we might think of today as the slavery that occurred, in our country, in America, during the Civil,
Although there
which was economic.
there were rules, there were different rules concerning how to treat or not to treat, and there was also an end to slavery. In the case of the Jewish slave, he would not serve forever. There would be a moment in which that Jewish slave would be freed. But slavery was slavery. It meant working endlessly without any kind of compensation. Yes. Sandy?
Rabbi, doesn't it say in the Torah sometimes an indentured servant versus a slave? I don't know if that's what Marty's talking about.
Slightly, yeah, it's a different thing.
It's a different thing, but as with regard to slavery itself, the slave was property of the enslaver, or of the he owned the slave. So I don't see there a very different definition.
Indentured servant is a little different here.
Yeah. Okay, Ivy?
I was going to mention that in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, during the Russian pogroms, there was a lot of Jew-to-Jew slave trade down into South America, like especially into Argentina, and a lot of women were sold into prostitution rings. And I think that kind of qualifies as slavery.
Yes, a very specific kind of slavery, but yes, no doubt. The polacas,
Yes.
we call them in Portuguese, the Polish or the Poles that were enslaved and worked as prostitutes to people who held their passports and would not give them basic rights and liberties. Yes, 100%. Okay, so let's delve into the sources, and we are going to see sources backwards tonight. So I will start with the more contemporary sources, because they will reflect what we are talking now. They are against slavery, and I will bring you both Abraham Joshua Heschel and Jonathan Sacks on slavery. And then I want to go to the original sources with you and see what the Torah has to say about slavery. And what I find fascinating, and we will see that together, that within the biblical text, we see already some kind of evolution. So we will see that the appearance of slavery in different books of the Torah is different between themselves. So among the different places that we see slavery in the Torah, we will see some progress. So bear with me. Let me share my screen. And let's start from Abraham Joshua Heschel. I would like to ask someone to voluntarily read for us. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who would like to read? Thank you, Ivy.
I look forward to privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Church synagogues have failed. They must repent. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare state of moral emergency. A Marshall Plan for aid to Negroes is becoming a necessity. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity.
Thank you. Such a beautiful, strong letter from Abraham Joshua Heschel to John Kennedy. And this is what we want to hear. This is what we want to listen about Judaism and slavery. And this is what we think today in the 21st century. But it was an evolution. It changed over time. It wasn't always like this. And even while Abraham Joshua Heschel was saying what he was saying, there was an internal debate here among different leaders, religious leaders, on slavery. Let's see what Jonathan Sachs says. Who else would like to help us out? Yes, Marty, thank you.
Freedom is more than an abstract idea. It means in an age in which slavery was taken for granted, it was not abolished in Britain or the United States until the 19th century. Letting a slave go free after 7 years or immediately if his master has injured him. It means granting slaves complete rest and freedom 1 day in 7. These laws turn slavery from an existential fate to a temporary condition. Slavery is not what you are or how you were born, but something that has happened to you for a while and from which you will one day be liberated.
So here, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs seems to start dialoguing with the sources that we will read in a moment. And he does not condemn as strongly as I would like him to condemn slavery. He says slavery is not what you are or how you were born, but something that has happened to you for a while, somehow saying that if slavery is for a while, it is somehow okay, somehow acceptable. And I'm not sure if it's what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs really thinks, or he's here trying to reconcile the sources, the Jewish sources on slavery and his own ideas and his own takes. But this declaration is definitely less strong than I would expect. And the reason why might be the sources that we are starting to study now. So let's see what Exodus, Shemot,
Rabbi, can
Yes.
you tell me what year that is that took place, that letter? Jonathan Sachs, the letter, the paragraph that you read before, what year?
Once again, Carol, I don't understand your request.
What year was the
asking
letter?
you
63, it said.
what year?
What
I
year?
can't, if I could read it, I wouldn't be asking
So
you.
Abram Joshua Heschel is 1963 to Kennedy, and Lord Sachs, I don't have the year, but it's 20th century.
Okay,
Yeah, it's
I was
20th.
just trying to have a framework for when this took
It's
place.
20th century because he just died a few years ago. I had the privilege of meeting
Yes,
him in person. So we are talking here about the last half of the 20th century.
okay.
So let's see a definition of a Jewish or a non-Jewish slave in order to help us understand the biblical sources. So there are a few ways to make sense of biblical slavery. First, we need to distinguish between the Torah's two categories of slaves, the Eved Knaani, non-Jewish slave or Canaanite slave, and the Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave. There were two kinds of slaves, Jewish slave and non-Jewish slave. Eved Knaani, Canaanite slave, and Eved Ivri, which means literally Hebrew slave or Jewish slave. The former, so the non-Jewish, refers to slaves who remain so for a lifetime. So non-Jewish slavery is forever. The latter refers to indentured servants trying to pay off a debt or raise money for their families. The Eved Ivri works for a set period of time and then goes free. So when a Jew was with a monetary problem, the Jew could be taken as a slave for a time, for a period of time, to pay his debt, and that he would be freed. He would be set free. As of a non-Jew, once slave, forever slave, he would be never freed. Harold.
What strikes me that instead of being either an indentured servant or considered a slave, why wasn't it just sort of like an employment agreement, that say, oh, you work for me, I'll pay you or credit you with a certain amount of money for and how long you stay with, and it would be, employer-employee relationship, which seems much better than slavery.
I totally agree with you. This is not what happened. Among other reasons, maybe because they did not know the work relations that we know today. The kind of working relationships that we have in our society today developed over time, but it did not exist back then. The idea that you had that you have rights as a worker, such as to rest, to work a certain amount of time, to get paid, and things like that, maybe did not exist the way it exists today. So this was the way for them to pay their debts. They became slaves. I will mute Carol for a moment, just. Okay. Yes, Marty Lesser.
Yeah, I have a question. This says the non-Jewish slave and the Jewish slave. Who's the slave master in those situations?
Jews.
So Jews can have non-Jewish slaves. Okay, got it.
Yes, Jews could have non-Jewish slaves and Jewish slaves.
Got it.
And now we will start reading the laws, the rules, according to the Torah. So in Exodus, Shemot, we read the following. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, you, a Jew, acquire a Jew as a slave. He shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. If he came single, he shall live single. If he had a wife, his wife shall live with him. If his master gave him a wife, then she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall live alone. Does not sound very nice, right? So if he came single, he would go single. If he came with a wife, he could live with his wife, but if the master found a wife for him, he would have to leave his wife and children behind because they would belong to the master. He is treated as the master's property. So he has no right over things he acquired during the slavery engagement. During the slavery engagement, everything he acquires does not belong to him, including his wife and children. It belongs to his master. Very harsh, right? Let's read the next quote. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl. How do I read this word? Owl? Owl? Oh. Oh?
All.
Oh. Oh.
Like the same as ALL.
ALL. Oh, okay. Oh. Because owl is another thing. Oh, right. And he shall then remain his slave for life. Okay, so if he wants to stay with his wife and his children, the solution is to become a slave for life. And then a ceremony would take place during which his ear would be pierced with an awl to mark him, to make him, to make it clear to everyone. It was a physical distinction. It was a physical mark, a piercing on his ear, showing that he has, by his own choice, more or less, right? Because he wanted that actually to stay with his children and wife. He has decided to become a slave forever. He has accepted life slavery. Let's continue. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, that was also an option. She shall not be freed as male slaves are. So the Jewish woman, the Jewish woman's slave, the female slave, the Jewish female slave, had less rights than the male Jewish slave. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. So her destiny was in the hands of the master. I know it's very uncomfortable, and it comes from a source called Torah.
Oh, that.
Yes. And if he designated her for his son, so if the master designates the female Jewish slave for his own son, he shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. If he marries another, he must not withhold from this one her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he fails her in these three ways, she shall go free without payment. So there is still some kind of obligations with regard to this woman slave. Finally, the last quote in Exodus, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod. So here it's just for us to learn that also striking slaves, beating slaves, was an accepted practice. And he dies there, and then he must be avenged. But if he survives a day or two, there's nothing to survive a lot, just a day or two. He is not to be avenged, since he is the other's property. So just if he dies directly from the rod, from the violence infliged on him, then there will be avenged. Very difficult, very, very sad, actually. Very, very, very not encouraging sources.
Rabbi,
Yeah. Yes, Martin.
when is slavery first introduced in the Torah?
Here in Exodus.
So we don't have slavery in Abraham's time?
No, not that we are aware of.
Okay, so this is the first time it's mentioned.
Yeah, as far as we are concerned, here is the first time that it was introduced. But you know what, Marty, it's a good question. Actually, Eliezer is Abraham's slave. Eliezer is the one who goes to find Isaac, to find Rebecca or Isaac.
Mhm.
And he is Abraham's servant. So yes, we have stories before this one of some relation of enslavement. What we will see now is that Deuteronomy comes and tries to fix some of the uncomfortable things we've just read. So as I told before, recently I taught, I said at Dvar Torah at our daily minyan, and I explained to those who were there that inside the Bible sometimes we have some passages coming to soften another passage, to make another passage more palatable, to make another passage easier to digest. So there is a kind of dialogue inside the biblical text that we see that consistency is not present everywhere, and sometimes we see that things are written in order to correct or to show some kind of evolution from one quotation to the next, one quote to the next. Yes,
Yeah.
Marty Abrams.
Yeah, is that possibly, I know I don't want to go off on a great tangent, but that's one of the possible reasons many people think Deuteronomy was written much later.
Right, right. So Deuteronomy is considered for the scholars to be a later book. And when this later book was written, it revisited the previous books with different eyes, because sociologically speaking, they were living in different societies. So yes, no doubt this is an important information. So let's see what Deuteronomy says on slavery. If a fellow Hebrew, man or woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out of the flock, threshing floor, and vat with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Bear in mind that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I enjoy this commandment upon you today. So this is still bothersome, but it's better than we saw before, because we see here some evolution. We here see some differences. Which difference do you see here when we compare it with the previous quotes?
You don't go empty-handed.
Right.
The other one, you got nothing.
This is the main difference. They only, before we saw in Exodus that they would live empty-handed, they would take nothing with them. And here they have some kind of financial compensation for the years of enslavement. Yes, Marty.
Does he get his wife and kids, or that doesn't go that far?
Here we don't see anything
We don't know
in that regard.
We don't see if that's replaced.
But Rabbi, it does say man or woman.
Right. This is a difference too. Before we saw that women given by their father,
yeah, but that's not the same.
would stay forever with the master, right?
Yeah.
And here men and women shall be freed after 6 years. So it's also an evolution. It's also an important difference. Okay.
They say him. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Let's read a little bit more on Deuteronomy. But should he say to you, I don't want to leave you, so if the slave wants to stay, want to remain with the master, for he loves you and your household, and is happy with you, you shall take an awl and put it through his ear into the door, and he shall become your slave in perpetuity. When you set him free, do not feel aggrieved, for in the 6 years he has given you double the service of a hired man. Moreover, the Lord and your God will bless you in all you do. So here they are preoccupied. They are preoccupied with the master, apparently, not with the slave that much. But what I find here a little bit different from the previous quotes is
Into the
that
door.
this slave is not staying in order to keep the wife and the children.
Yeah.
He's staying because he wants to stay. He loves the master, he loves the household, and he's happy to stay. And then the ceremony takes place. Yes, Marty
What is
Abrams.
that into the door? That wasn't there before. I'm not sure what that means. Taking it
understand,
all
sir,
and put it
this
through
is
his ear into the door.
This is
And-
the place the ceremony took place. It was a public ceremony. It's not actually into the door, but
Oh, okay.
by the door.
Okay,
But
because the other one didn't say that. The first one earlier.
it says something about a door there.
I
too,
don't remember.
think.
I don't remember the door part.
I think.
With
Yeah.
an all, and they
Oh.
shall know. He put
Here,
his ear
He,
with
sh-
an all.
he shall be
Oh.
brought to the door or the doorpost.
Okay, I didn't remember that. Thank
Okay.
you.
He shall
Okay.
be brought to the door or the doorpost. So this is the place where the ceremony, it's not a private ceremony. It's a public ceremony. It's for everyone to see what is going on. And everybody to know that it was a choice made by the slave and not by the master. Yes, Harold Kisling.
I think it's also symbolic of the door is where you would leave if you were going to leave.
Beautiful, right.
You know, nailing the awl for your ear to the door is basically saying you're not leaving.
Right, right. Thank you so much. It's very symbolic, right? The door would be the way out, and instead of leaving, this slave will stay forever, will stay for good. Okay? So, Deuteronomy we saw. The last quote we will see, it's from Leviticus. And Leviticus brings a very, very different take on slavery. Let's read it together. If your kinsman under you continues in straits, if your brother becomes poor and must give himself over to you, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. So this is Harold's idea. He shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year was every 50 years, right? After 49 years, 7 cycles of 7, there was an important Jubilee year. Then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral holding, for they are my servants. They don't belong to you or to the master. They belong to God. God has freed them from Egypt, or us from Egypt, in order to become our new master. We are not meant to have any other master. Whom I freed from the land of Egypt, they may not give themselves over into servitude. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. So this is by far the most liberal, progressive take on slavery that we find in the entire Torah. So the take of Deuteronomy, it's a much more progressive take than the take of Exodus, but here in Leviticus, we see the most liberal, the most progressive, the most beautiful take on slavery. Let's read this one again before we close the what I've been sharing with you. So if your kinsman under you continues in straits, literally, if your brother becomes poor and must give himself over to you, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. So here, what the text is saying, Jewish slaves shall not exist. It's not about, it's your brother, right? So it depends on how you read your brother. If you read your brother as your fellow Jew, we are talking about Eved Kadaani, the Jewish slave. If you read your brother, as some did, as any fellow human being, so this can be understood as a statement against any kind of enslavement. And then this is a really, really, really progressive quote coming from the Torah. It's the abolishment of slavery whatsoever, 3,500 years ago. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. Then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral holding. For they are my servant, says God, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. Difficult this word to say. How should I say?
Ruthlessly.
Ruthlessly. Ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. Okay,
Right.
so I'll stop sharing and then we will be able to have a conversation before we say good night. Yes, Marty Abrams.
Yeah, with all this, we understand it was part of the needs of whatever was in society, slavery. It had a place, but nowhere does it go into the morality of slavery. Let me just leave it at that. It was an accepted thing. No one ever thought at that time, this is really not such a great thing to do. You're taking someone else's life.
I think this last quote from Leviticus goes a little bit into the morality because God is saying no one should be enslaved because they are my servants. I have freed them from Egypt, and slavery is unaccepted. So I think it goes into the morality a little bit, not in Deuteronomy nor in Exodus, but in Leviticus, I see a little bit of the morality being faced.
Could you put that on the screen again? I just wanted to look at it.
Sure.
Just that reading. Just that part. Leviticus.
Absolutely, yes. Would you like to read a third time for everyone?
If your kinship under you continues in straits, if your brother becomes poor, now we're talking about a relative, and must give himself over to you and do not subject him to the treatment of a slave, he shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall serve with you only with the Jubilee. Then he and his children with him shall be free. But remember, we're talking about a relative. Be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral holding. For they are my servants. Now, meaning really no one everybody is God's servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt.
Or at least the Israelites. We don't know about everyone, right?
But again, they're talking here, if I'm not mistaken, about a relative, a brother. But for they are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. You should not rule over them ruthlessly. Well, they're saying you could still rule over them, but don't rule over them ruthlessly. You shall fear God. I don't know if that really, maybe a tiny bit when it's sort of dealing with a relative or a brother.
No, here,
No,
brother is not brother. Brother is your
Oh.
fellow, is your fellow Jew.
Oh, okay, so then I misunderstood that.
Yeah,
Or if your but if your kinsman under you continue, so kinsman means fellow Jews.
fellow Jews. Yes.
Yourself. So again, this is saying if it's a Jewish slave, well, we're going to be a little different. Now, I guess if it's a non-Jewish slave, maybe this doesn't apply.
So there is two ways
no,
to read it. One way to read is saying this passage is trying to abolish Jewish slavery.
Yeah.
Or you may say we are all brothers and sisters,
Yeah.
and it's abolishing every kind of slavery in general.
But then that last sentence bothers me a little bit. But even though it says, I don't want to dwell on too long, but you shall not rule over him ruthlessly means you're still ruling over him, but be relatively decent.
But as a laborer,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
as a slave.
You see, it's a matter of how the words are interpreted by various.
100%. It's always about interpretation. 100%. 100%.
This is in Leviticus, but in Deuteronomy, this is a little better, as you said, than Deuteronomy, which is later.
Exactly. And this is not what we wanted to see. We wanted to see this passage in Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy is not only considered to be a later production, but it's also the conclusion of the book, right? It's the last book. It's like the last chapter. And it would be very beautiful if this passage would appear in Deuteronomy. I think it would be great because we will say, you see, they have evolved and they got to the conclusion that slavery is a bad thing. But unfortunately, it wasn't me who edited the Torah.
Yeah. So, Rashi probably had a lot to say about this too.
But for sure, so for centuries, Mishnah,
later on.
Talmud, Maimonides, Rambam, and Rambam discusses, Maimonides discusses if a slave that lives inside Eretz Israel is sold for a master in the diaspora, what happens, and things like that. So we see in the time that Maimonides that slavery was a reality still. Yeah.
There was a reality.
I mean
reality today.
I mean Jewish slavery.
Yeah, there's still slavery.
I mean Jews being slaves to Jews. Okay. Yes, Marty Lesser.
I think there's one part of this that's different than all the other things we read.
Why?
In the other passages we read, people were sold into slavery. In this case, you're talking about somebody who is doing poorly economically or financially and sees that his only way out is to sign up with the slave master to do work and get paid for it. He voluntarily does it. I mean, he may be squeezed, but he's voluntarily signing up for the servitude that he's going to give.
For 6 years.
With all the other advantages. So this is a little bit different than people who were forced into slavery.
Yeah.
I think it's a very important difference. I agree. I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
Very good point.
Yes. So, yes, Carol. Carol, you are on mute. Let me open it for you.
I can't.
Now we hear you. Please.
Okay. So during the Exodus and all the Jews left Egypt, how did they determine who were the slaves and who were the hierarchy, like the priests and the Levites? Because at some point there had to be some delineation of a caste system in order for slaves to exist, especially coming out of slavery. Not everybody came and said, I need to sign up for 6 years because I'm very poor and I have no money.
So The answer is we don't know, but I suppose that once the Jews started dealing with economy, with trade of goods and with valuable belongings, there started being differences between poor and rich, as in every society. And the Jewish slaves were always poor people looking to pay their debts. So people who fell economically in the society in such a way that he or she has no other way to survive. And probably being a slave had at least the advantage of being fed, poorly fed, but they at least had food, had a place to live. So I think we are talking about people in despair, in an uneven, unfair society. How did it get there in the first place? I think it's an excellent question. We don't have the answer why they didn't prevent it to happen, but it's still happening everywhere, Carol. Unfortunately, as you know, here in the US, in Israel, everywhere. Slavery officially does not exist, but unofficially, there are people living in such a miserable condition that it's comparable to the situation of slaves. Harold.
It seems that, I mean, almost all of these situations emanate from financial issues, either one way or another, that people either sold themselves into slavery or somehow bought from others. But what it doesn't seem to say, and I think, I don't know the history of sociology that well, but weren't the non-Jewish or other slaves were the captives on from wars or from skirmishes or from when one people or an army, whatever, invaded and conquered an area, the conquered people would become slaves.
This is what I understand too. I understand that the non-Jewish slaves were locals that were conquered by the Jews, and the Jews enslaved them, war captives.
Could we enlist Juliana to possibly give us some insight into the anthropology of what we're talking about this evening?
Wow, it sounds like a very, very beautiful idea. I cannot answer for my wife because it's not really safe to answer on behalf of your wife.
Absolutely not. If you'd like, I maybe in the future she would like to give us a class on some of the questions we have about this time of history.
I think it's an excellent idea, and maybe we could start next year, because today is the last meeting of this
yes
year meaning right until June, and from before the summer and after the summer, how it works here in the US. So after the summer, when we resume our meetings, I will definitely ask Juliana if she's willing to have a conversation with us and teach us what did slavery mean and how it evolved and where we are today. I think it's a fascinating, sad subject.
Perhaps we can invite her as a guest speaker.
Excellent. excellent. If you want to talk to her, feel free to do so. If not, I'll probably see her still tonight.
I would hope so.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I don't know, Rabbi, I don't know how vital this is, but I just Googled something that said slavery started in 711, the year 711, whatever that, and it ended 1490. I don't know what the hell that. Maybe it's something.
Slavery started on the year 711.
Slavery was a practice throughout Al-Andalus and the Iberian Peninsula between the 8th century and 15th century. And this includes the periods of the Emirate of Cordoba, the Caliphate of Cordoba, the TAIFAS, I can't even rule, and the Emirate of Granada. I'm not sure
The Emirate.
whatever the heck I'm reading, but that's what came up when I said, when did slavery begin?
So we shouldn't go to 7-Eleven anymore.
I don't know. I have no idea what I'm assuming.
Slavery started over a fight over a Slurpee.
Yeah.
We'll have to check that out
But
further.
the Jews were enslaved much before.
Much
Yes.
before, right? So I
Yes.
don't know what the hell that means. Maybe I didn't ask the
Okay.
right question.
Thank you very much, everyone. I wish you a beautiful night and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
My
Yasher
pleasure.
Koach,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Laila
Yasher koach.
tov.